In this lesson, we will work with Painter's text tool. When I choose it in the toolbox, I see that my property bar provides me with a number of choices, including font and point size. Why don't we do some typing and then we will alter the text. So clicking on the canvas immediately brings up a new layer, a text layer, which has its own special icon indicating that this will be editable type. So I will type Painter and put in a second line for 2016. Now let's change the color of the text. Let's make it red. Let's change the font to Gill Sans Bold. There we go. Let's change the point size just a little bit bigger. And we have an alignment choice here. I'll align center, and then I'll need my layer adjuster to move things back into position. So the text tool, once again, is going to allow me to change the text attributes or the shadow attributes independently. So shadow is something we can create using either of these icons. This icon is blue, indicating that it is engaged and there's no shadow. But if I choose external shadow, this is what I get. An internal shadow looks like that. Let's go back to the external shadow. And notice on the text panel, you've got just about all the choices that you had in the property bar. You can change your font. You can change the point size. You can have shadow or no shadow up here. But there are also some things that you do not have in the property bar, including tracking. Tracking is simply the spacing between letters. You can tighten or loosen the tracking. And you can change leading, that is the space between lines. You also have a curve option. When there's no curve, it's considered flat. But let's see what happens when we pick curve ribbon. And you'll notice that there is a vector path for the curve, which you can manipulate using your shape selection tool. This is the way you can alter a curve by dragging an anchor point and moving one of these direction lines. The angle or the length of it will affect the curve. You can add a point. Let's use that tool for doing that somewhere, wherever you wish, and you can use your shape selector tool once again to control the curve. So you can make extremely precise curve shapes with that. I show you curve perpendicular, which I don't care for very much, and the same with curve stretch. So let's go back to curve flat or no curve at all and move it over once again. If I want to alter my shadow attributes, I'll use this icon. I can reduce the opacity of a shadow. Let's make it very faint. Let's bring it back up to 100% again. I can blur the shadow. I can create a directional blur where the angle will be affected according to this slider here. Let's make that blur even more extreme. There we go. And we'll bring it back down to no blur at all. I can change my text attributes in a similar way. We can make the text less opaque. Interesting effect there. We can blur the text. I'm not sure I like that, but it's nice to know you can do that. So we'll bring that back down. Now, if you wish to paint on text or apply some other special effect, you're going to need to convert it to a default layer. Even if you attempt to paint, let's see what happens when I try painting with my pattern pen. What happens is I get a warning that I need to commit to an image layer or default layer. I will commit. And so now notice that the icon for that layer has become a standard icon, and I can now paint on the lettering, which I could not have done if it was still editable text. Looks like I'm painting on the shadow as well, which I don't quite care for. In any event, why am I able to paint just on the lettering and not on the background? This is because I have preserve transparency engaged. If I did not have that on, now when I paint, I'm painting all over the entire layer. So preserve transparency is a very handy option if you want to restrict your action or your stroke to only what is already on a layer, where the rest of the layer is transparent. As you can see, when I made my canvas invisible, this gray and white checkerboard indicates transparency. Another way to refer to that commit command is rasterizing. When you rasterize an item that is vector-based, you are turning it into pixels. I'm going to undo that last couple of strokes. I'll make the canvas visible again. And now we are back to our editable text layer. I will make the shadow go away. And I'll show you that you can not only convert text to a default layer, you can convert text to shapes. And so I did that, and notice that my layer has become a group. Now, what's in the group? Let's spin that triangle down, and we'll see that each of the letters has become a shape. This is the shape icon on the layer panel. I'm going to make the numbers go away. I'm going to select all of them and delete them so that I'm working only with the painter letters. And because they are now shapes, I can go to my shape selection tool. I can actually, let me zoom in a little bit here. I can move the entire letter around if I want to. I can select one or more points and affect them independently. So this is a great way to create some sort of distortion on your letter before you rasterize it. I'll just undo that. Let me show you a little trick. By dragging along just the bottom of the lettering here, and notice the points that are selected are just those lower points, I'm now going to drag those points down, and so I have created a rather unusual effect for my lettering. So I think you can see the possibilities there. We continue working with text effects. I have typed the word coffee in black using a font called Hot Coffee. You don't have to have that in your system, but any bold sans serif font should do nicely for this technique. I'm going to fill the lettering with an image, and the image that we'll use, which you'll find in your working files folder, is an image of coffee beans. So I'm going to select all and copy. Now I can dismiss that image without saving it. And I'm going to paste it onto the canvas. So there we have it. I'm going to enlarge it so that we can, let's get that transform tool. I'm going to enlarge it so that it covers up the type. And now after committing to that transformation, I will change the composite method from default to lighten. And what I've just done is basically replaced the black with the image because the image is lighter than the black, and I have allowed the background, which is lighter than the image, to remain. So using black lettering allows you to fill the lettering with an image. Let's look at another item here where I have typed the word stones, and I made a note by changing the content of the layer that this font is called Fat Cat, in case you have it. Otherwise, any bold font will do once again. This time, I'm going to fill the word with a spray from the image hose. So choose the image hose in your brush picker, and then go to your nozzles and choose stones. Now, when I begin to paint on, yes, I am asked if I want to commit, and I do. So now I can spray stones into the lettering. Let's cover up all of that magenta. There we go. And of course, we're seeing, you can just keep doing it until you get just the right combination of stones that you want. And of course, we are working with preserved transparency on, so the background is protected. I'll switch to the canvas and switch to a different nozzle. I'm going now to a nozzle called Concrete, and now I'll be able to spray concrete behind my stones. Looks like a construction site. All righty. Now then, we can no longer apply a shadow to the stones lettering because it's not editable text anymore. but it is a layer, and any layer can have a drop shadow applied to it. So that's what we're going to do now. Using Effects, Objects, Create Drop Shadow. I'll accept the defaults, and I see a drop shadow has been created. I also see that this is a group that was made automatically so that stones and shadow are independent layers. And I'm just going to select shadow and move it around. I can change its opacity, make it more opaque, less opaque, and so that works nicely. Another sequence of effects that I'm going to show you begins with the letter W, which I created in the font Cooper Black, and orange is going to be a good color for this. This particular font gives us a nice bold letter with some serifs, and you'll see that when I apply a sequence of dynamic plugin effects, what we get is some wonderful results. So I'm going to make a duplicate of this layer. Just go to Duplicate Layer, and I'll move it over because they were overlapping each other. Let's move it up here. I'm going to apply the dynamic effect called Tear. Yes, I will commit. And now I can see that I better move some of these sliders around, or I won't be able to even tell that it's the letter W. So let's see, that's pretty good. I can change the color of the tear of the torn edge as well. So yeah, that's good. I like that. So let's click OK. Let's make a duplicate of that. So duplicate layer, and I will drag that over. And this time we will apply the burn effect. And yes, I'll commit. So burn is going to give us just what you'd expect, and we are going to get a variety of options here with respect to how that burn applies itself, and I will click OK. One more duplication, and I'll move that over here, and this time I will apply Bevel World. Yes, I will commit. And with Bevel World, you have a very large variety of sliders for changing just about every aspect of the bevel effect. I kind of liked what we had before, so I'm just going to reset it to that. I still have lighting options available to me, including lighting colors. So I can change all sorts of lighting combinations here, and I'll click OK. So with this sequence of dynamic plugins, we have created an extremely interesting look of an antique carved letter from this very basic W. The reason these are called dynamic is because at any time, and notice that there is a special symbol on the layer here, at any time, if I double click that, I can change the parameters. I can change all or any of these independently of each other, and I'll just cancel that. So we have explored a number of text effects in this movie, and I hope you will enjoy making your own. In this project, we're going to create a postcard for Santa Fe. It might look something like this when we finish. At least we will begin with most of the same image sources, and there will be a wide variety of painter techniques and effects that will be used as we proceed. So we will have a couple of images that are simply pasted in as layers. The lizard will have a drop shadow applied to it. We will also use the lizard to create a pattern and paint with it. We will apply some effects to the photo of this adobe structure, and we will create a nozzle composed of variations on this pink boot. In addition, this fiery image will be created with a particle brush. So let's begin with the Canyon Road image. I will expand it, and let's have it fill the screen. Zoom to fit should do nicely. Let's see what size it is. If we want to have a postcard size, it should be 6 by 4, so I will just make that 6. Looks like we have to trim some from the height. So let's put the rulers in. That's Command or Control R, and I'm using inches, so 6 across as we just determined. and 4 down. So I'm going to trim. Let's use the crop tool. I'm going to trim to 4 inches. Now, just in case, I want to make sure that I have that at 4 inches. So it looks like I need to adjust my crop tool a bit. That looks good. So I'll double click inside, and now let's make sure that we have a 4 by 6. I will just make that 6, and that's close enough. So I'll click OK, and let us then add a photo effect to this image. I'm going to the Effects menu, Surface Control, and use the Sketch option, which will produce a black and white image, and I can adjust these sliders if I wish. Oh, I like greater sensitivity. That gives me more detail. Smoothing, well, I think less smoothing, but not minimum smoothing. That looks about right. And let's see what grain does for us. Not much. So I'm going to click OK. And now I want to bring back some of the color from the photo. So I will use the Edit Fade command, and I will see about how much of a fade I want in order to create something that will make for a good background image. I quite like this, so I'll click OK. And at this point, I happen to have my Airbrush's custom palette open, and let's see if we can get that to expand a little bit. There we go. So I have iterative save, which will allow me to instantly make changes, not to a JPEG image. I'll have to cancel that, but I need to save it as a RIF image. So let's proceed with this. Notice it is now called Canyon Road 1_001. Every time I make enough changes to want to save the next version, I will use iterative save, and these numbers will increase as we go. So I will save that to the desktop. Now let's get our burro image. And our burro statue is here. You have a choice between the original photo, which will require that you remove the background, and that is something that can be somewhat tedious, time-consuming if you want to be very clean in your selection of the statue away from the background, especially in this area here, but it's doable. Let's take a look at our channels palette just in case. Aha, someone has done just what we need. They have made that channel by saving the selection after doing all the work. Must have been me. So let us then load the selection, and that's done over here. Statue is the only thing we have to choose from, so I'll click OK. There it is. Now I'm going to copy and paste into the background image. Let's move that over, and also let's make it a little bit smaller. So I will use my layer adjuster transform tool, and with my shift key held down, I'll just make it a little bit smaller, move it over to there. That looks pretty good. So I'll accept that by choosing the check mark. Now let's add the lizard. We have the lizard open. There it is. It was originally a scan of a lizard magnet. And again, I have done the work of making that selection for you. So we can load the selection, and we are loading it from lizard. So when I click OK, we need to load it from the image, not from the channel. And I will once again do a copy and a paste. So let's place it where we want to, although as long as it's a layer, we can continue to move it around. Our layers panel is also available, and I have these as large thumbnails. Maybe that's too large since we're going to have quite a few of them to scroll through. So let's go here and make them medium-sized thumbnails. That should do nicely. We can see what we're dealing with here. Let's put a drop shadow on the lizard, and that's done by going to Effects, Objects, Create, Drop Shadow. I will accept these defaults because I know that I can always go and alter the shadow. As soon as I made that drop shadow, Layer 2 and Shadow was created for me, a little group composed of the original lizard plus its shadow. Notice I can turn the shadow on or off. I can turn the lizard on or off. That's rather interesting. Ghost of a lizard. So in any event, I can do things with the shadow, such as simply move it around. I can change its opacity. I can distort it. But I think for the moment, this will be just fine. And I believe I'd like to make another iterative save. Let's put a small jar into the image. And I don't need to make a selection because, as you can see on the layer, there is transparency behind the jar. So all I really need to do is select all and copy and then paste into the image. And you can see there's no white background that came along with it. So let's move that over to down around there. Let's give this a drop shadow as well. So that would be Effects, Objects, Create Drop Shadow. And it's right about there. And we have its little group. So I'm going to actually move that shadow over a bit and make it less opaque. And now that's what we like to have. I am looking now back at the original, the earlier version, and I'm thinking we don't need to have that second jar. In fact, I quite like seeing the feet of the burro and the shadow. So one jar is going to be enough. Now we're going to take a break here. And when we come back, we will make a pattern from the lizard image, and we will create a nozzle from the boot image. Let's continue developing our Santa Fe postcard. We have the lizard magnet open, and we can see from our channels panel that we can simply load that channel as a selection. So let's do that. Load selection and choose lizard. And when I've done that, I have the marching ant selection. All I need to do now is use the capture pattern command in the pattern control panel. So let's open that. I've done it already, so I can see that it's there, but I'll show you the process in any case. So we go to capture pattern. And if we wanted to arrange for a different organization of lizards for a pattern fill, we would use these options. But since we're just going to be painting with the pattern pen, those don't matter so much. So I'll just call it lizard once again. There we go. Now when I click OK, yes, I'll replace the one I made before. And now I ought to be able to use my pattern pen masked and go on to our composite and paint with lizards. I'll go to the layers panel. Incidentally, I typed in the name of jar and lizard for those two layers so that I could keep track of what's what as my layers accumulate. Let's make a new layer right now and have it be up at the top. And this will be the layer that we will spray our lizards onto. And I'll have to turn off preserve transparency. So pattern pen masked on this new layer is going to allow us to paint lizards wherever we may want to do that. That looks pretty good. Pattern pen without the mask would give us that white background, which is not what we want to do. So just to show you the difference there. And I'll use iterative save once again. So we now have 4 stages for this graphic. Let's go to the pink boot. I'll bring that up and we will make a nozzle. That's going to involve several steps. The first thing will be to load the selection. As you can see, once again, we have a channel that was made in advance so that we can load the selection. And let's do that. And we now have the marching ant selection. I will do a copy and paste. So now we have just the boot with a transparent background. The canvas might as well be deleted. So I'm just going to select all and delete the canvas. At this point, I need to make 3 or 4 versions of this layer with different angles and different colors. So let's make a copy of the layer, duplicate layer, and on that copy, I will use and adjust colors to get a hue shift. Purple looks good. Yeah, I like purple. A little bit less saturation. Okay, that's going to work. I'll click OK. And now I will also want to make a transformation. Let's go to the transform rotate command under the edit menu, and I will be able then to type in let's say 45 degrees, and we'll see what happens there. Let's drag this over a little bit, and I'm wondering if I can move that by hand now. So I'm thinking that this is going to be a good angle, so I will commit to that by clicking on that check mark. Now I'd like to make another copy, and I'll just make the pink one invisible for the moment. So let's use the duplicate layer copy once again. And on this one, let's make that one invisible. On this one, let's make another hue change. Let's see if we can get to green is nice, but more saturation this time. So I will click OK, and let's also make a transformation here once again, where I think I can put in another 45 degrees or simply drag it to the position I like. I like that. And now I have one more to go. So let's make a duplicate of that layer, duplicate layer. And now I'll make that one invisible. And this one, let's see if we can go to a golden color on this adjustment. Pretty close. Let's get even more golden and then more saturation. I like that. So let's click OK and make another transform rotate. And looks like I have to type something in. And then I can still make my own angle. So what angle do I want? I think maybe like so. That looks good. So let me commit to that. So now we have 4 of these boots of different colors, different angles. And what I need to do now is group them. So I will simply, holding my Shift key down, make all 4 of those be selected. Then I can use the group command, group layers, and I can then go to my nozzles window. Let's go to Media Library Panels for nozzles. And here's where I can make nozzle from group. And this is what I'm getting. I will save that. Let me save that as boot noz. There we go. And save that. So I'm going to save this to my working files folder for this chapter as a RIF file. And now let's see if I can load the nozzle using that command from the nozzle panel. And let's go to my working files folder. Boot noz. I see it there, so I will open it up. And now let me go to my composite, my working graphic, and see if I can choose an image hose variant. Let's go to image hose and choose spray with size, a function of pressure. And by golly, I am now able to spray boots all over the upper section of that image. And I put that on the same layer as the lizard pattern, but I think maybe I better not do that. I'd like to have that be on its own layer. So I'll call for another layer down here. And now on this layer, I will make my boots. These boots were made for spraying. There we go. And one more iterative save. Let's take another break here. And when we come back, we will create some text and finish up this postcard graphic. Continuing with the postcard project, I'm looking back at the original version now, and I'd like to make a departure by not doing the thought bubble. Instead, I'd like to put some text into the postcard. I was exploring several possible fonts, and I quite like Eraser Dust, which you see here at the top. Mistral is in the center. And I stumbled on this delightful one called jicama, which is a crispy vegetable. So any of those would do nicely. Lots of choices there. Here is what eraser might look like with the drop shadow. And if I choose that layer, I'm going to eliminate the drop shadow because I want to create a different drop shadow once I have committed this text to a default layer. So let's make this text on a curve, and let's use our shape selection tool to tweak this to just what we would like to have it look like. I think that's going to do nicely. So let's just move that over. This looks like a good spot for it. and I'm going to commit it to a default layer, convert to default layer. Now I can add a drop shadow using Create Drop Shadow, which is at the top of my list now because that's the last thing that I did. So we will accept the defaults, and now we see that drop shadow, and we see the grouping. Incidentally, if I am happy with my jar and shadow and my lizard and shadow and don't need to keep those items separate from their shadows, what I'll do is go to collapse the layer. I will also collapse the jar and shadow layer. So here we have Santa Fe and shadow. I'm going to keep them as separate items for now because I would like to do a bit of painting on the lettering. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so we can see it much closer. Incidentally, if I tried to paint on that group, I would be warned that I can't paint on a group. So let's not do that. Let's open the group and let's choose the Santa Fe lettering. And now I can start to, aha, I see the problem. I'll undo that because I need to engage preserve transparency. Now, when I spatter some color on my lettering, I am not going to also be spattering the background. Let's switch to a turquoise color, maybe a light turquoise, and spatter along the top of the lettering. See how that looks. So now we've got a nice combination of turquoise and orange with some adobe in between. I quite like that. And I think I'm going to make the shadow a bit stronger. Let's make it as strong as we can. That looks just fine to me. Let's go back and zoom out just a little so we can see the result. I am pretty satisfied with that. I also have another version. I have this version because I couldn't decide between jicama and eraser dust. So once again, I have made this text on a curve. I'm going to commit it to a default layer, and I'll zoom in a bit, and I'll use that technique once again of sprinkling. Okay, I don't want to do it on the group. I want to open the group, and I want to work on the lettering. So let's sprinkle a bit of turquoise on the tops of the lettering using the sprinkle airbrush. And let's move to a darker orange to sprinkle near the bottom of the lettering. I quite like that as well. And I think I'll also make the shadow a little bit farther away. So I'll need to move it. I can do that. I can move the shadow a bit farther away so that it's a bit stronger. And now I think that looks just fine. So I am willing now to make the Santa Fe group of lettering with shadow. Collapse the group. And all that's necessary now on either version is to have some kind of flame or smoke come out of the jar. So I'm going to use a particle brush. Let's go to particles. And I'm going to use Spring Chain Smoky. On this version, I have not collapsed the group, so I will do that. I will go to collapse the layers, and I will collapse lizard as well. So now on the jar layer, which I need now to raise up above the lettering in the stacking order, I need to disengage preserve transparency so that I can let the smoke effect go up and through everything else. Let's make a darker color for some of that, and let's make perhaps a bright red for some of that. And I think we have a pretty interesting result. I'll do the same on the other version. Let's put that on the jar image. And let's make some of that, I think, maybe a golden color. And so there we have it. So whichever version you like, or both, you have created a postcard that celebrates many of the images and colors of Santa Fe. Let's use this photo of Rasa, which you'll find in your Working Files folder, to explore some of the dynamic plugin effects. These are found at the bottom of your Layers panel. 3 of them are grayed out now because they require a layer to work on. But we're going to look first at brightness and contrast. So we see the familiar sliders for those two variables. And when we have achieved what we like, we can click OK. And now there is a new layer, which is a special kind of layer. It can always be changed as long as you save your file in RIF format. So now we can double click on it and we can make those changes. This is a non-destructive kind of layer. And it's quite similar to the adjustment layers in Photoshop. So clicking OK and returning to the canvas to apply another effect. Equalize will allow you to move your white point and your black point independently in order to restrict or expand the range of tonality. Gamma refers to changes in the midtones. So once I have what I like, I'll click OK, and now I see another dynamic layer has been added to the list. I can reduce the strength of one of these effects by simply changing the opacity. Let's go back to 100% once again. And so I can now mix and match. I can see what does it look like to have equalize without brightness and contrast, with brightness and contrast. And so there are some choices to be had. Let's take a look at glass distortion. I have attempted to apply that to one of the dynamic layers, which is not something I wanted to do. I wanted to go back to the canvas. So it's a good thing I had this commit warning come up. I'm going to cancel and go back to the canvas. And now I will attempt to apply glass distortion. And here I have some choices for creating a kind of shower door effect. I can use paper. There's no selection, but there is image luminance is the value of the image itself. And original luminance refers to whatever the pattern happens to be, unless, of course, you actually have an image that's designated as a clone source. I'll go back to paper, but I'll choose a different paper than just the basic paper. Let's see what Pebbleboard does for us. How about marbled substrate? That's kind of interesting. Let's increase the amount. Let's make some additional softness and variance. And now if I click OK, once again, I have a new dynamic layer. I can reduce the effect of that. And of course, I can see how does that look without the other adjustments. One more of those is posterize. With posterize, I get to determine the number of levels. I'm actually going to cancel this because I want to see the effect on the canvas without the other adjustment layers active. So on the canvas, then, once again, let's look at posterize. And posterize will give us the opportunity to restrict the continuous tone of a photograph to a relatively small number of flat color fills. So if I choose 10, this is what I have. I'll click OK. And now I will add the glass distortion effect and the equalize effect and the brightness contrast effect. I think I'll go to glass distortion once again and reduce its strength. So let's make a commitment to our combination of effects by simply dropping all. There we are. And now I want to show you an item called kaleidoscope. Now this is not the same as the kaleidoscope painting, which I will remind you of in a moment. But this kaleidoscope effect requires simply that you decide how large a square you're going to have. I'll make mine 150 pixel square. And now when I drag this square around, I am getting a kaleidoscopic image based on the pixels underneath. I can keep making that change as I move the square around. Only when I commit or convert to a standard image layer will this kaleidoscope effect remain as it was when I made that conversion. Now, just to remind you of what kaleidoscope painting is, we'll go back to the toolbox and we'll choose mirror painting. And now with just about any of my brush effects, let's make that not white on white, but let's make that happen. So you see that I'm getting a kaleidoscope or a mirror effect here by simply going back to that mirror tool, I can change that to the kaleidoscope tool, which simply gives me a lot more panels or segments on which to paint. So that's kaleidoscope painting, not to be confused with the kaleidoscope dynamic plugin. So let's go back to Rasa and thank her for her participation. I think I might just save this. I will flatten it and just do a save as dynamic Rasa and save her to the desktop. There we go. Now back to our blank image. It will be blank again as soon as I do a select all and a delete, and as soon as I turn off my kaleidoscope painting effect. Coming back to our dynamic plugins, I'd like to show you these three items that are grayed out: bevel, world, burn, and tear, but I'll need to have layers first. So let's make our first layer by simply making a rectangular selection. Let's make it a pale blue, filling it with the current color, and then doing a cut and paste maneuver so that we have it now as its own layer. Back to the canvas, and let's make another layer using the oval selection tool. Let's see if we can grab that and go here. And now let's fill that with something other than the current layer. I think I'll go to my gradient library and choose vivid colored stripes, and now click in there for a different kind of fill. And again, a cut and paste will create a new layer for that. For our third layer, let's use the lasso tool, and I'll just make a freehand selection, and let's fill that with the source image, which in this case will be the current pattern. So I'll make a layer of that with the cut and paste command. And let's stick with that layer, that irregular shaped layer with the pattern fill. And let's go now to look at Bevel World. And Bevel World, you could see instantly, is going to create a combination of effects to give the edge of this layer a bevel. We can change many of these variables. Let's get some smoothing in there. Rim slope, cliff portion, cliff height. Once you have gone to the trouble of making the changes that you want, and you want to be able to retrieve those settings, it's a good idea to add a preset to your collection. There isn't anything in there except the default. So I will suggest that we perhaps look at the lighting effects as well, which are over on the right. And let's just commit to this. And when I click OK, I now see that once again, I have a special kind of icon for this layer, meaning that I can always go back, double click on it, and get those settings to alter once again. I'll cancel that. Well, that seemed to have resulted in a different set of options here. Let's go back and see what happened there. Is this a default? In which case, we can just change that once again. And let's just make that into a preset. Let's call that Rhoda Demo preset, and we'll save it. Okay, so now I will click OK. Let's go over to our plain blue rectangle and apply a burn effect to it. And you instantly see that there is a burn edge, which you can control with a number of these variables. I like jaggedness. And you can also change the color of the flame. That's rather nice. So I will click OK. And again, we see that there is a dynamic layer icon. Let's move to that center layer, the one with the gradient fill, and apply a tear to the edge. And I believe you'll instantly see that there is a torn look. Because the color of that torn paper is so close to the white background, it's hard to see. So I'm just going to change that to a different color. And that's a very bold way to notice that torn edge. Once again, we have a number of variables, not so many this time, but we can make a lot of specific changes. And I'll click OK. So we see some very dynamic, literally dynamic ways to affect the edge of a layer. I'm going to give you a break at this point, and when we come back, we're going to take a look at Liquid Lens and liquid metal. Let's continue working with the dynamic plugins in the Layers panel. We'll look at Liquid Lens, and before we start that, we'll have to have an image to work on. So I'm going to simply make a selection and choose a gradient for a fill, and the vivid mixture gradient looks pretty good, but I want to alter it somewhat. So I'm going to choose the gradient control panel, and there we have it. So from the default, I will choose another combination, and I think I like that one. So let me now click inside this area with the paint bucket. And now we are ready to dismiss that panel and go to our Liquid Lens dynamic plugin. There are several tools here for making distortions, and we'll start with a brush and simply drag pixels away from the center, making kind of a star-shaped configuration. I'll switch from the distort brush to a bulge tool, and if I just make a little squiggle on the end of each of these arms of the star, I will get a bulge on the color that I select. I'll go now to the pinch tool, and if I simply drag pixels, I will find that they pinch together. And so we're making an interesting combination of image effects here. Let's go to Right Twirl, and here's where I can create a swirl or twirl by simply making a little squiggle, and that right-hand twirl is created. I'm going to use the left twirl on the buds at the end of the stars. And so here I have a sequence of effects created entirely from these distortion tools in Liquid Lens. Now, notice, if you will, on the Layers panel that this Liquid Lens floater, which is dynamic, of course, that means we can always go back and make changes. It has not affected the image on the canvas. The image on the canvas has remained untouched, so this is a non-destructive kind of effect. And the eraser tool will simply, if you drag it around, will simply bring back the original pixels in that area. And so you're basically eliminating the Liquid Lens effect and revealing the canvas underneath. Let's make some circular distortions. We haven't tried that one out yet. I'd like to do that on the edge. And now let's use the eraser on some of those edges. And I could do an erase effect here too, so I can get these little squiggles to look as if they're swimming away from the center, quite like that. Now, rain will basically just apply droplets to the image to make it look like it's melting. I can stop that effect by simply tapping on the canvas, and I can clear everything away by clicking on the clear button. So that's your introduction to Liquid Lens. Let's just cancel it, and let's also eliminate that gradient. When I choose liquid metal, I don't need to have either a layer or an image to work on. I can create liquid metal strokes, and let's go to standard metal. That's the default mapping, and you'll see what I mean. When I choose the circular drop, I can make liquid metal blobs that tend to blend together and attract each other, as you can see. I can choose the brush tool in order to make a liquid metal stroke, which is composed of a sequence of blobs or dabs or drops, and I can see them individually by choosing display handles. Now, notice all of these many drops that compose a stroke. I will select this drop up here, and now I can move it around. Even if the display handles is unchecked, I still have that drop to move around, and it still maintains that surface tension, if you will, of attraction between the droplets. I have a choice for changing the size of a selected drop. I can change the volume. I can smooth things out or reduce the smoothness. And then I can also make new strokes with a change in the size and these other variables as well. Now, there's more than just the standard metal map, and by map, they're referring to a reflection map. You can see that this is a photograph of a room, and the effect is to make it look like there is a very strong reflection on the surface of these drops. Another map that's quite different is Chrome 1, Chrome 2. Interior is another photo of the inside of a room, and it gives you a very different kind of look. A very interesting possibility is to use the clone source for your map. And the clone source at present is the current pattern, which I chose to be shiny cable. I think you get a very interesting effect with shiny cable. I'm going to make another stroke, and this is showing us shiny cable. I'll make a few more blobs, drops. And if I should want to change to a different pattern for the clone source, such as silver tubing, what I'll need to do is just momentarily switch to another map, and then when I go back to clone source, now I have updated the clone source to the current pattern. And so I believe I'll try that once again, going to yet another one of these. We had shiny cable. Let's try tree trunk pen. And so once again, I'll switch to something else and then go back to clone source. And now here we have the tree trunk pen. We can use an eraser to basically drag through these drops and strokes and eliminate them. Let's see what happens when we display handles. It looks as if we still have those handles showing as blobs, even though we have eliminated their visibility. I'll uncheck that. Let's see what happens with rain. With rain, we are applying drops all over the canvas. I can stop it by tapping, and I can also, of course, clear everything, but I won't clear because I'd like you to see what happens when we use refraction. The refraction slider makes the drops and strokes less opaque, and it's interesting to see how that looks on top of an image. So I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to go back to the canvas and create an image by simply making a selection and filling it with, I'll choose another pattern. I'll choose leather. And then when we go to Paint Bucket and fill with source image, we have that. And incidentally, all of those droplets became filled with the new source image. I'd like to turn this fill into a layer. So I'm just going to do a cut and paste. Now I have that layer. Now I can put liquid metal over the layer, double click on it so that I get to go back to my liquid metal dialog, and I'm going to change the map to interior. And now I'm going to reduce the opacity of that. And so I think you can see that there is now the look of a more transparent liquid, maybe a viscous liquid. Let's see how that looks without surface tension. Let's bring surface tension back again. Let's change from interior to standard metal. And so I now call your attention to the look of the highly refractive, which in this case will mean transparent nature of the drops and strokes. So you see you can get a lot of very interesting effects using liquid metal. I will click OK, and I invite you to experiment with this and the other dynamic plugins in Painter 2016. Painter offers a number of options for automatically applying marks to your canvas, whether it's a single stroke or an entire painting. We will begin with the single stroke option and proceed to more complex maneuvers. But first, let's take a look at our workspace. We have our color picker open. Our layers panel is available. We have a clone source panel open, and auto painting is going to be very useful. It's found near the bottom of your window menu. There it is. And it's grouped with underpainting and restoration, which we will not use for this section, but since they're grouped, I figured let them all stay together. We're also going to use a reference image and the flow maps library. Moving over to the other side of the canvas, here's where I have an Auto Paint 2016 custom palette, which you can import from your working files folder using the custom palette organizer and the import command. Let's take a look at those brushes. Real Bristle Drip is at the top of the stack, and it's a dynamic speckles brush. So now I can just make a freehand stroke with the color that is coming, in this case, from the clone source, which happens to be this lotus petals pattern. But let's go to the normal way to choose color with the color picker, and now I can show you a green stroke with Real Bristle Drip. Let's move down to Speckle Gravity Brush, and I'll make a stroke with that. Let's make that a dark green. And we see that that is also a dynamic speckles brush, but it has some different qualities than the Real Bristle Drip. Impressionist is familiar if you've used Painter for earlier versions. It is in the Artist Favorites group, and it is composed of a series of little teardrop-shaped captured dabs. I'll switch to another color and show you Speckle Cake Decorator Cloner, which is part of the cloners, but it's also a dynamic speckle type of brush, and it is dragging color in from the lotus petal pattern. Speckle Bristle Impasto, let's make that ordinary color, will give us a stroke like that. Very beautiful impasto or thick paint stroke. And finally, the flow map enhancer is behaving in accordance with the current flow map, which when I open the flow map library, I see is Madness, and we have that swatch in our Auto Paint custom palette. I'll switch to Clouds, and I'll switch to another color so you can see the contrast there. So I can make for some very interesting effects with the flow map enhancer. Now I'm going to clear the canvas and show you that we can record a stroke. I'll just make flow maps go back to its compact version for now. Let's choose the Speckle Gravity brush, and when I go to my brushes menu and choose record stroke, I'll make a curved stroke, and now I will go back to the brushes menu and choose playback stroke. And now if I simply tap the canvas and again, I can have the same stroke recreated automatically. It's not going to be exactly the same look because of the variability of the dynamic speckles, in this case, the gravity brush speckles, but let's just see what happens when we change color and apply more strokes. We can also apply that stroke with a different variant. So let me choose Real Bristle Drip and choose a different color. And now we're getting a wonderful effect from this Real Bristle Drip, which does some nice smearing as well. But notice all of the strokes are the same size and at the same angle as the original stroke that I recorded. If I want to, I can save that stroke, and I will do so. I'll call it Curve. I think I already saved a curve, so I'll call this one Curve 2. And sure enough, if I now look at my list of strokes that are available, many of these were provided in Painter. I only made these last few myself. So you can choose from any of these special strokes. Let's try Zigzag, for example, and let's stick with Real Bristle Drip. And now when I tap my canvas, that zigzag stroke is going to be created each time I tap. I'll go to a different color, and I'll go to a different variant. This is the Impressionist variant. Let's see what Speckle Bristle Impasto does for us with that, and that's quite lovely. Even the way it is applied is unusual. I'll choose Speckle Cake Decorator Cloner, and it automatically went to clone color. So now if I make that zigzag dab, those colors are coming from the lotus petal pattern. So this is a fun way that you can recreate strokes and experiment with some of the automatic features. Now, suppose you would like to have your saved stroke play back at different sizes or different angles. and there is a way to do that. So I'm just going to clear the canvas and call your attention to the auto painting panel, where we have a list of strokes that's identical to the list that we had under the brushes menu, including the ones that I made myself just a little bit ago. And if I choose curve 2, that one there, and this time I will allow for a large amount of randomness and different amounts of these other variables. I'm not quite sure what they're going to do, but I like the idea of randomness and speed. So let's put those up on the high side. And we are in clone color mode here. So choosing Impressionist, I am now going to play back and see what I get. And I'm going to stop. That's awfully speedy. Let's move our speed down a little bit. And also let me choose clone color, and I will switch to the speckle bristle impasto as well as clone color. So now when I hit the play button, I see a variety of positions and sizes of that curved stroke. So we've already got some interesting ways of creating variation, even though it's the same basic stroke that we recorded and saved. If I stop and switch to another of the strokes that has been provided for us by Painter, let's take Sketchy Square, for example. What happens now if I switch out of clone color to a purple color and use my speckle cake decorator? Now I'll hit play once again. Well, I did reduce the speed, so it's not coming at us quite as fast and furious as it was before. But I am seeing some little dabs that are quite clearly thick paint, impasto paint, and they are also quite different in terms of their size and angle. So with that, I'm going to stop and give you a break. And when we come back, we're going to continue looking at ways that you can control the automatic effects in Painter. We continue examining the auto painting features with Smart Stroke Painting. Now, when that is not engaged, this is what we've done before. We have chosen strokes from this list. We have adjusted sliders and speed here. And then we have chosen a variant and clone color or not, and automatically applied the strokes. Now, when we have Smart Stroke Painting engaged, we don't get to change any of these sliders except speed, and we don't have access to any of those stroke shapes. Let's prepare to do some Smart Stroke Painting by opening an image that's in your working files folder called Adirondack Chairs. I'll go to File, Quick Clone, and then move this over to the center and double-click on the magnifier tool so we get 100% size. We can turn off tracing paper because the strokes are going to be made automatically, but it would be nice to be able to see the image in our reference image panel. So I will open the Adirondack Chairs image for reference. There it is. Now I have added 3 items to the Auto Paint custom palette, and they are all from a category called Smart Strokes. I have pastel chalk, acrylics captured bristle, and colored pencils. Let's turn Smart Stroke Painting on and turn speed down just a little bit. And with colored pencils, our variant, and clone color enabled, let's just hit the play button and see what we get. Well, we certainly are getting dabs that drag color from the source image. We're also getting intelligent placement of the dabs. They are not being placed randomly. They are being placed in accordance with the contours of the elements in the image. As this develops, you'll see that the shape of the chair, the construction of the chair, is being taken into account by these orange dabs and red dabs. Elements in the background are also being accommodated according to edges and contours. I'm going to stop and I'm going to increase the speed a bit, and I'm also going to switch to the pastel chalk variant. And now I will tap the play button once again. So we get a fatter dab, a larger stroke here. And once again, I think you can see that those strokes are being applied in a smart way in accordance with the shapes of the chairs and the other items in the image. Notice the tree trunk is being created in accordance with its contours. So we could just let this go until pretty much all of the white paper is covered up. But I think you see the smart stroke feature. So I'm going to stop that. Now, what would happen if I had smart settings enabled? I'm going to delete the contents of this clone copy, and I'll return to the colored pencils variant. Recall that colored pencils made a small dab when we were just using smart stroke painting. With smart settings, watch what happens. I'll tap play, and now these are fat strokes, aren't they? They are going to get smaller as we go. It's quite similar to the way you would do a traditional painting. You would begin with large areas of tone and color, and then you would gradually get to smaller areas for detail using smaller brushes and smaller strokes. And as we watch this develop, we will notice that the strokes will be getting smaller as more detail is required. So we can simply sit back and enjoy the process. Quite small now, and we can continue to see detail develop. You can stop at any point. If you like this abstract look, you can just click the stop button. I think we'll let it go for a little bit longer. And of course, you could add to this abstract painting with any tools or techniques that you wish, right on the canvas or on another layer. So the dabs are getting pretty small now as details develop. I think that's pretty good. So I'm going to click on the stop button, and I am going to invite you to practice doing some smart stroke painting with smart settings or without smart settings. And this concludes our visit to the auto painting feature of Painter 2016. Painter provides you with a large number of choices for creating watercolor paintings. There are 3 categories. The first one, historically, was digital watercolor, and it remains part of the collection. Let's take a look at some of these variants. I have created a custom palette for you for each of the categories, and of course, you can import all of them through the Custom Palette Organizer import command. So, digital watercolor. The broad water brush makes a stroke that has some interesting pigment buildup on the edges. The coarse mop brush, same color, but we get a richer deposit of color and a nice feathered edge. Let's look at salt. And salt will deposit some little grainy areas that will pick up pigment. And this is very much like the traditional technique of sprinkling salt on wet paint. And the salt crystals pick up the pigment. When the painting is dry, you simply brush away the salt crystals. Let's take a look at watercolor sponge. We don't see much there in the stroke preview. So after I make my stroke, and that is a wide area which softens as you go, and it even will soften the pigment that has been deposited underneath the previous strokes. Let's make that a little more obvious as to what it is. So I'm going to go for the text view. If I hold my Control key down or do a right click on the PC, I can simply go to text view, and now I will know what that is, a little bit more obvious. Gentle wet eraser is a way to lift some color, not too much, because you don't want to completely erase pigment down to the paper. That does not imitate traditional watercolors very well. Notice that all of these strokes have been applied on the canvas. This is not the case for the other 2 categories. watercolor and real watercolor. Both of these have to operate on a special watercolor layer, and we can see from this little droplet icon that these are watercolor layer brushes. So I'm simply going to eliminate what I had on the canvas, and I'll double-click the Digital Watercolor tab to compress it. Now let's use watercolor variants. We have Wet Wash Flat. I'm just going to change color here. Wet Wash Flat is a lovely, relatively smooth stroke with some soft edges. We have another eraser variant here, and again, if we simply drag into wet paint, we will see that effect. Notice that when I chose eraser salt, the color picker took me to white. So if I now try to make another stroke, I will have to go and choose color once again. So let's choose Grainy Wash Bristle. And that certainly is bristly and grainy. Notice that there's paper grain showing rather boldly. This is the current paper. It is rough watercolor in the watercolor papers group. And I think I will drag that into my custom palette by holding down the Shift key. I can simply drag that swatch over, and I'll just move Iterative Save Over so all my papers can be in a little group there. Another paper that I had previously included is Horizontal Chaos. So with Grainy Wash Bristle, let's see what Horizontal Chaos does for us. And sure enough, we do see a dramatic result. Let's look at Speckle Runny Paper Reveal. And because it says speckle, we know that it is new in this version of Painter. So let's see a wonderful, dramatic evolution as the stroke does definitely reveal paper. Let me just make another one of those strokes going down. It begins as a relatively simple stroke, and then these little grains, these speckles, disperse as the paper is revealed. So it is a well-named Speckle Runny Paper Reveal. If we choose a different paper, coarse watercolor paper, then we get a very different look with that stroke. And it reveals that paper, which is coarse watercolor paper. Let's take a look at Smooth Runny Bristle. I'll just change color. And a smooth runny bristle is definitely bristly and runny, and also will show you the paper. So smooth runny bristle. How about runny wash flat? Let's take a look at that. And the flatness comes from the shape of that brush tip. As you can see, it's an oval. So if we drag a stroke across, it's going to be wider than if we drag a stroke down. In all cases, however, it does reveal our current paper, which is Horizontal Chaos. So this was all done on a watercolor layer. You could continue working with real watercolor on the same layer, but since we don't have much room left, I'm just going to make that layer invisible for now, and I'll call upon a new watercolor layer, not an ordinary layer. If I hold this down, I will find new watercolor layer is created for me. And once again, I'll just make that one go away. And let's work with real watercolor. We have Speckle Tiger Lily, a new variant based on the dynamic speckles. And we see something that responds to paper texture and also melts and flows as we go. I don't know if it's going to be a flow map type of brush or not. We do have some flow map brushes. Let's look at Noisy Flow Map Fringe. And when I drag down, I am not only seeing my paper, but also a flow map effect on the edges. Now, just to make that clearer, I'm going to switch to a simpler paper texture and continue by making a stroke that shows us the current flow map, which is fine dots. You can see that not only on the edges, but inside as well. Let's change to the clouds flow map, and I will open the flow map library just so you see what some of these choices are. So with clouds, you see this result, quite different. And Madness comes as a flow map as well as a paper texture. So I imagine if you put them both together, you'd have something really exciting. I will now show you Splatter Dry, which is a way to create some organic looking spots that can look accidental, and that can be an interesting traditional type look. Real wet detail is going to allow you to make a thin stroke. This is pressure sensitive, so if you have a heavy pressure, you'll get a thicker stroke, a more opaque stroke. A lighter pressure will give you a thinner stroke that is also less pigment deposited. So with that, let us take a break, and when we come back, we will create a watercolor painting. Let's create a watercolor sketch using this photo, Canyon Road 2, which is in your Working Files folder. We have already loaded the image into our reference image panel so that we can check it out and use it to sample color as we need it. We have a flow maps panel open in case we want to change our flow map from clouds, which is already available in the watercolor sketch custom palette that you can import using your custom palette organizer. We also have a rough watercolor paper texture and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 watercolor variants that come from the real water as well as the watercolor category. We don't have any from the digital watercolor category. We also have a pen variant, which we are going to use to create a sketch that will be the first layer. Let's turn the photo into a layer so that we can reduce its opacity to serve as a tracing paper. So I'll do a select all and a cut and a paste, and now we can reduce the opacity of that layer. I will create a new fresh layer, a standard layer, on which to make a sketch. And so with my Quill Pen 2, I will choose a medium dark brown, and I will begin to create a line drawing that will be very rough. I am thinking this pen is too thick, so rather than have it be 5 pixels wide, I think I'll reduce it to about 3.5 pixels. That's much better. I'm just going to undo those last few strokes. And now I think we are ready to make this drawing. Very rough indeed, just to serve us as a guide, although it's quite possible that we might want to have this sketch layer as part of the drawing at the end, and we can always reduce its opacity or change it any way we like. So a few of these stones indicated, the planters, a bit of the foliage, and the other adobe structure back there, a little bit of foliage back here, and let's get a few more of these timbers that stick out and cast these wonderful shadows on the house. So let's see what we have so far. A few more stones down here and the path. A couple more stones. Can indicate them just with the little dark shadow areas on the right side. So with our photo made invisible, I think we might just have enough to start painting. Let's just make those windows. And now I think we can begin to paint. So I'm going to choose a color using the dropper tool. I'll get this nice pinkish adobe color, I'll call it. And with a noisy flow map fringe, let me just go in there and make some large strokes that will develop over a few seconds into a lighter color. Let me get some of this greenery in the front. That's a little too dark. Let's get a little bit lighter green, and I'll sample the brown of the door and of this structure made out of wood slats. Let's get that pinkish adobe in the back and more of the original adobe color from the front. So we're getting some wonderful blooms, which is the term used for this kind of accidental looking fringe. And of course, the noisy flow map fringe is just the tool to use for that sort of thing. Let's get a little bit of the foliage in the back over here. And I see kind of a pale blue for the windows. Actually, let's get a bright blue for the sky area. And then I'm just going to go to the color picker and choose a pale blue for those windows. And I think we might be at a point where we can, let me just put a little bit of a path down there, where we can switch to another tool, and perhaps Real Wet Jitter Smooth Variable will be the tool for this. And I think I will use my pinkish Adobe and develop a little bit more with this tool, get a little bit darker there. And it's also showing me the paper texture, which is a very rough watercolor paper. Let's go down in this area as well. And I think I can afford to go darker on, not that dark, but let's make for a somewhat darker pink. I'll just use my color picker for that to get in this area here. And I think I'd like to get some green. Let's see if we can get a reasonable green to go up in that section. So if I zoom out a bit, let's just see what we have, and it's looking pretty good so far. I can certainly begin to put some detail in there, and the detail brush that I have is the Real Wet Detail. I'm going to zoom in again to do that, and so with a dark brown, or at least a chocolatey brown, maybe darker than that even, that's almost black. I think I'll undo that last and get this brown here. And then to put in some of these shadows, we might very well need to go darker than that. So maybe black is, in fact, called for. Very dark brown, chocolatey brown. And then we can just build that up. We can build that up as you can do in traditional watercolor just by going over a section, and the transparency will enable you to get darker as you go. Let's get a nice dark shadow in this area here. And let's also make for some of these openings. I think I may want to go back to my pen, back to the CorelDRAW pen, which is operating on this layer. And I'd like to go in there and make for some more detail, which will be difficult to do with the watercolor brushes. Let's take a break at this point, and we will finish this piece in our next movie. Let's continue with our watercolor project. I saved this image as Canyon Road 2-WC, as in watercolor, in RIF format so that I can use iterative save going forward. We no longer need the photo layer, so let's delete it. And let's also reduce the opacity of the sketch layer. One advantage of working with painter watercolors is that the colors remain wet until you deliberately dry them, and you have that command in the Layers menu, Dry Watercolor Layer. I won't use it. You can also create a watercolor layer from whatever is on your canvas, and it's grayed out right now, but you can re-wet a watercolor layer. So let's go back and apply some more watercolor strokes. I think I'd like to create the look of these stones at the base of the house. Let's zoom in a bit and see what those look like. A little bit more of a zoom, and there we have it. If I use my eraser salt, I think I might be able to get an effect that's quite similar to that. Let me choose a kind of a pale tan, a warm tan, and go in there with some salt. Maybe let's add more color to the salt and go in there once again. And I think we're getting some interesting effects. I can enlarge the size. It's difficult to enlarge salt in real life, unless, of course, you choose kosher salt. That's larger than ordinary table salt. So that is a kind of an effect that will enable us to imitate something of those stones, and we might go back later to improve that somewhat. Now, I'd like to also work on the bushes in front of the house. So let me then reduce the magnification. If I choose Command or Control key, I can zoom out once again. And I will use the dropper to get a dark green. And with Splatter Dry, I believe I can get some interesting effects where I can create some dark green foliage near the base of the house. One thing I wish I had was a larger piece of paper to work on. And unlike in traditional watercolors, that's something I can easily do in Painter. I can add pixels to any or all of the edges. And that's exactly what I'll do right now. I'll go to Canvas Size in the Canvas menu, and I will add 200 pixels to the top, 200 pixels to the left, maybe 50 pixels at the bottom, and maybe 100 on the right. Let's see what that looks like. Let's zoom out to see the whole thing. And this is going to be a better composition, for one thing, and also it's going to enable me to splash around a little bit with some free-form watercolor effects outside of our main interest, which is the house, of course, which is this beautiful adobe house in Santa Fe. So let's see what happens since we know that everything is still wet. Let's see if we can extend the sky somewhat. Let's look at the entire image in the reference image. And so with blue, let's choose that blue once again, maybe a little bit lighter blue as I spread out. I'll take my Real Wet Jitter Smooth Variable, long name for a brush, and let's see what we can accomplish with that. It's definitely showing us the paper texture. And as it is absorbed into the paper, it makes for some lovely effects, for some blooms and some edge effects that are quite wonderful. Let's do the same with the foliage here. I've got a dark green going along with some tan, and if I use that same brush, Real Wet Jitter Smooth Variable out here, I can extend those trees out into the distance. I'd like to try splatter dry once again on this part of the foliage. Let's see what happens when I spray some of this olive green, and perhaps I can get a light orange in there as well. I'm not sure it will lighten because for the most part, watercolor strokes are build-up method. That is, they will get darker and darker. It's a little more difficult. It's quite difficult, actually, to lighten a watercolor area, unless you can coax the color to be absorbed again, as in the salt technique. So, okay, let's try salt once again. Let's go to Eraser Salt and reduce the size to its default size by clicking on the Reset tool. And now I will go into using white. I'll just go into this area with a little bit of salt, and we get some interesting results. Let's work on this additional house back here. That was a pink color, and if I use Grainy Wash Bristle, I'll get some more pink to spread out a bit over here as well. And now I believe I will switch to green so I can get some more of the foliage to go out into that area. Although I certainly don't want to spoil that wonderful bloom that we had here. I think I'm actually going to undo those, something you can't do with traditional media, and go for a much lighter green. And now let's see if I can achieve an effect that isn't going to change this foreground tree much. So that's not too bad. Let me go to my noisy flow map fringe once again and choose the gray for the path. Let's extend that path somewhat with the noisy flow map fringe. And at this point, I am just making up the background here, no problem. I can use a very pale blue. I can use my Option or Alt key on my keyboard just to pick up that pale blue. And then using Real Wet Jitter Smooth Variable, it's hard to remember that whole name, I can go out and extend that sky even more. Let's see if we can develop a bit more detail on the house itself. And so for this, I will zoom in. I'm at 100% now, and that's fine. I'd like to zoom in on the reference picture also so you can see that there is this little bell that's hanging over the house, and the color is kind of a dark teal. Let me get that selected. I think I'll make that a little bit brighter here. Let's make it that color. And if I go in there with my Real Wet Detail, I can create that effect. I can also, zooming out just a bit on our reference image, let's just make sure that we see all we need to see. I can create more detail with the portion of the door, the lintel over the door. And let's choose a medium, kind of a russet color for that. And again, with my Real Wet Detail brush, I will make this stroke here. I'll do the same over here. And that is actually having the effect of lightening the color. So it appears that that is also a way that we can have an effect if we want to lighten a color. So I'm choosing now this deep orangey red, and I'm going to go over that section of the wall. I can do some very interesting textural effects by simply scribbling around with my Real Wet Detail brush. I'll continue doing that for other areas here. So I'm creating some wonderful texture. Let's go down to that area as well. And now if I choose this brown, it would be nice to be able to lighten up some of the wood on that door. So this is what's happening here. I'm able to do that. And let's see if I can choose this color. And I don't want to lighten this area much. I'd like to use my grainy wash bristle, actually. That's a bit large. Let's go back to Real Wet Jitter Smooth Variable and make for a darker tone here. And then I can go back in with my Real Wet Detail and create some lighter strokes for that boarded up section, it looks like, for the window. Let me work on lightening up the edges over here as well with the Real Wet Detail. And if I choose this orange color and drag in that area, I'm getting some good results. So this appears to be a way to emulate absorbing wet color. Now here I'd like to go darker again. So I'm going to use the noisy flow map fringe right in that section. And let's not leave a white halo around that tree. Let's make something happen over there as well. And maybe Real Wet Jitter Smooth Variable will help over here. Let's zoom out so we can see what we have so far. And I am thinking it looks pretty good. Let's just go into this window area and maybe increase the opacity of our sketch, where we can see that the windows have some interesting qualities. But the rest of the sketch, maybe we could get rid of. We could erase at least some of it. I'd like to leave this area in as well. So let's erase parts of the sketch that we don't need. I'm going to get rid of all except what we need for defining those windows. I'll get rid of this area here, and I'll get rid of those little squiggles and that line and these lines, and I'll simply leave these lines. I'll get rid of the rest of it. Again, not exactly traditional, although if you had a pencil sketch to begin your watercolor piece traditionally, you could erase the pencil even after all of the watercolor had been applied. I think we have a pretty nice looking watercolor sketch of this adobe house. We're going to use the photo of Justin, which you see in the reference image window, in order to create an experimental mixed media portrait. Mixed media is traditionally defined as any combination of wet or dry together on paper, board, canvas. It can include collage elements, found objects, whatever you can apply or attach to a surface. So we're going to create a multi-layered image that has many effects and a variety of techniques and tools used to compose it. This will serve as a creative way for you to practice some of the techniques that we have done in previous movies. Let's analyze this Justin 008. That means it was the 8th version in the iterative save process. Incidentally, this is available in your working files folder if you want to examine the layers at your own pace. I have a liquid metal floater at the top. It's still in dynamic mode, which means I could go back in and change those liquid metal bits. I have a layer composed of stones that were applied with the image hose, stones being the nozzle. If I turn those two layers to invisible, we see that the next layer has had some parts of it removed, as you can see by the layer mask, and I'll demonstrate that once again as we move forward. This is a layer. If I can make all the other layers invisible just for now and turn this into default, notice that many of the layers are in different modes from each other. When this layer is in default mode, you can see that it is simply a color scheme alteration of the original image. It uses the impressionist scheme in the underpainting panel. So moving down to this item, and it's in screen mode now, so it's invisible, but let's make it default, and we can see that it is the result of the Apply Screen effect, which you'll find in your Surface Control menu. Let's move down to Woodcut, black and white only. And again, there has been a layer mask applied to remove parts of it. And now we see the pop art fill, which looks wonderful with the woodcut combination. So let's go back to our original version. And once again, we see the combination. I have another completely different mixed media concept going here for the second version, where we have a liquid lens floater. When I make that invisible, you can see the result. It has not only an effect on the face of the photo, but also on the background. Very interesting distortions there. If I show you this layer, not in gel mode, but in default mode, you'll see that it has quite a bit of texture associated with it. Let me zoom in a bit. And I think you'll notice that there is the texture called Madness, which is part of the watercolor papers library. And I applied that using Apply Surface Texture, which is also in the Surface Control Effects group. Let's move down to layer 5, which is now in screen mode, but in default mode, we can see, especially if we increase its opacity, that this is an image of Justin composed of blobs, where each blob was filled with Justin's eye. And the technique there is simply to select and copy Justin's eye. And then when you go to the blobs command, and I can show you where that is in Esoterica blobs, you can simply decide to fill your blobs, once you have determined how many and what sizes, with what's in the paste buffer. And that simply means what's in the clipboard. So I'll cancel that. Moving down to this layer, and it's in hard light now, but let's make it default. We can see that it is a zoom blur. Now let's go down to this layer, which is in lighten mode, and in default mode, we can see that it is a pop art fill. Finally, on this layer, we see a pattern fill with a pattern that was composed of Justin's mouth from another photo. Let's see if I can find that, and we can open that up. Justin smiles. And so that's the photo that we took a selection from and then made a pattern for that fill. So you would not really be able to determine all of those elements when you simply look at the composite. You do need to analyze it by looking at the composite methods and comparing each layer with the others when they are invisible. So let's take a break at this point, and when we come back, we will do a new mixed media portrait of Justin. We'll begin our new mixed media portrait of Justin by making a series of copies of the main photo. We also have Justin Smiles open because that's going to come in handy in a little while. But for the primary photo, let's do a select all, a cut, and a paste, and another paste, another, maybe that's enough for now. We can always do more. So on each of these 4 layers, I plan to have a different effect. Let's begin by making blobs. And I think I'd like to use the smile on Justin for the content of the blobs. Recall that we used the eye in a different version. So here we are. I'll just zoom into 100%, and now using the rectangular selection tool, I'll make a selection of Justin's mouth and copy it to the clipboard. That's Command or Control C. Now let's go to the top layer, which is layer number 4, and use the effect. We have blobs at the top because that's the last thing I used to demonstrate, but it's in the Esoterica group, as you can see. So blobs. Now we are going to choose not current color, but paste buffer. And now we will see that Justin's mouth certainly does appear in the blobs, but we need more blobs. Let's make 75 as the number of blobs. 76 is close enough. Minimum size, I think, should be 40. and maximum size, let's say 90. And now we have a collection of blobs. If we're not happy with that particular blob fill, we can always refresh the randomness, and then we will have a different arrangement of blobs. I don't think that's any better. Let's try refreshing once again and see what we get. I'm going to settle for that. So I'll click OK. And now that is our top layer. Let's make that invisible for the moment and apply that pop art fill. This is one of my favorites, so I think we'll do that to this version also. And I'm just going to zoom out so we can see a little bit more of the face. So we go to Effects, Esoterica, Pop Art Fill. And as always, I get to choose two colors. I also get to choose the scale. As I lower the scale of the dots, will allow me to actually see the image in better resolution. I will change to a magenta for the dab color, and I will choose a flesh tone for the background color. If I invert the colors, I get a very different effect, and I think I will click OK on this. Notice I was using image luminance as the way to determine the distribution of dabs and background. If I used original luminance, then that would give me, believe it or not, that is Justin's smile, because that is the current pattern. And I'm just going to go back to image luminance and click OK. Let's see what happens when we combine the top layer with the second layer, which is layer 3 in this case, by simply changing the opacity of the top layer. But now let's just make them both invisible and work on another fresh layer. And let's apply a surface texture here. And the surface texture can be paper, image luminance, that is the actual light and dark of the image itself, or original luminance, and now we can really see those teeth on the pattern from Justin's mouth. I think maybe I'll keep that, and I will click OK there. But now I would like to restrict that pattern to the background. So what I need to do is make a layer mask. I can just choose New Layer Mask from the bottom, and this will enable me to, using black and any sort of mark-making tool, to use a chalk or pastel. And now with black, I can remove that effect simply by scribbling, painting. When I use black on a layer mask, I am making that portion of the layer invisible. And I just will continue until I have the face smooth once again. I think maybe I'll also use black on the hair, or at least part of the hair. I think at this point we have what we need. And if you'll notice, that black area is now showing in the layer mask as the portion of that effect that is not visible. I think I'll make his neck smooth once again. Okay, so we now have 3 effects. Let's see what happens when we put this into darken mode. That's kind of interesting. If it's all the way up to 100%, even more interesting. Let's see what happens when we have the pop art fill layer in a different mode. How about hard light? That's looking good. And now we can alter the texture with a different mode as well. How about gel? Different. Let that be difference for the moment. And let's also, this is looking very bizarre. It also looks very much like a Van Gogh self-portrait on a bad day. So we have a lot more to do here. Let's just make those top 3 invisible once again and work on this layer. What can we do to influence the result? Let's go and check out some of our effects and see if we can do a high pass. I'm going to go to the high pass option, which is an interesting effect that basically enhances the edges. And so if I make that even more using Gaussian, I'm thinking Gaussian is better than, I normally do use Gaussian, but now I think I'll use circular because I'm quite liking some of these bright color effects. So a bit more. Let's click OK. And now that has affected this layer. So if we now make the other layers visible, we have a result that I think might require some changes. perhaps to the blobs. I'm going to remove some of those blobs by making a layer mask, and then again, painting with black on the layer mask for the blobs. And I can perhaps remove some of the blobs so that we can reveal a little bit more of Justin's face. So that is looking better. Let's see if we can make that hard light. Let's see if we can make this pop art fill layer another kind of composite. Not different, but let's say multiply. Well, that's looking kind of interesting, but let's make that less opaque. And so we begin to see something interesting develop. Let's take a break and we'll come back with another session of mixed media portraiture. During the break, I remembered that it would be good to save our composite, so I used the iterative save command and saved it as Mixed Media Justin 001. Now, let's add another layer, and on this, I'm going to put some painterly clone effects. I have the Portrait Cloner's custom palette open, and you can access it using your custom palette organizer and the import command. It's waiting for you in your working files folder. We have the original photo of Justin up, and when we go back to our composite, we see that Justin Original is our clone source. So on this new layer, let's choose a splattery clone spray. Well, clearly the source is not the image, but the current pattern. So I just need to go and choose the image and then be sure to open Justin JPEG as the clone source. Now I can simply go and spatter some of Justin on this layer. I think I'd like to try the Van Gogh cloner as well. And it will help because this is a very thick impasto. Zoom in to 100% because it is better to see the effect of a thick texture when you're at full magnification. So we have some wonderful things happening over here. I think I like this better than the spattery effect. If I wanted to use Impasto Cloner Jitter Etch 2, I could do that, and this will give me a very thick impasto effect. Let's just zoom out so I can see where I'm spraying. That should do nicely. If I want to bring back a bit more detail, still using a pencil sketch cloner will do nicely for that purpose. So we want to bring back some of that eye and the mouth. And I believe we have a nice new layer. I think I'll do something else in this area here. Let's use the flat impasto cloner, and I'll bring it back to its original size, which is quite large. And so we can get some very bold, smeary type strokes there. And let's do another iterative save. Now we have, yes, I will replace my original number 2, which was for practice. And let's just zoom out to see where we are. I do like the result. Let's see what happens if we reduce the opacity of this new layer. At full opacity, this is what we have. I think I'd like to have some of those underlying layers show through a bit more. I know I can always use a layer mask, and let's do that. Let's zoom in and use a layer mask on this layer. And of course, working with black and working with our square hard pastel, I can reduce the opacity enough to see where I am painting. I quite like that third eye. So let's make sure that we get that back in there. That's looking good. And we have some nice texture effects there as well. And just a little bit more on this area here to get one of those smiley blobs, another smiley blob. And I think we might be at a good point for this result. I would like to add a couple of image hose sprays. And for that, I will choose the image hose and spray size P. And I want to go to the nozzles. I'm going to choose little houses and make a new layer for that. Let me spray some little houses. Turns out that these look like the kinds of Victorian houses you see in San Francisco, and Justin lives in San Francisco, so that seems appropriate. Maybe we can try a different composite method, not darken. Let's see what we get with luminosity. Well, that's kind of interesting. But let's also see lighten and possibly just a little bit less opacity, and that looks good. I'm going to switch to another nozzle. I'm going to use glass pebbles on a second layer, an additional layer, and spray some glass pebbles, which is suggested by the fact that Justin is a stained glass artist, among other things. Let's put a drop shadow on those pebbles, and we can do that with the Effects Objects Create Drop Shadow command, and there they are. Of course, every time you make a drop shadow, you get a group made automatically, and we can just collapse those layers, and now it's just one layer. Zooming in once again, I would like to enhance some of these smiley blobs. So I'm going to take the Dodge tool, and if I can find the blob layer, there it is, right on that layer, I'm going to brighten up some of these smiley mouth images. There's one over there. Let's drag and see where else we can find these things. I think I'm going to zoom out to see the effect at 50% size. Maybe the glass pebbles could be a little bit less opaque. And I believe we have achieved a rather interesting version of Justin. I think he will approve.